All right, good morning, everybody. Is this thing working? Good morning. Welcome to the Robert Family Entrepreneurship Speaker Series. For those that don't know, this series is made possible through the generous support of Ned Robert, whose vision and partnership continue to advance entrepreneurship and innovation programming here at the Knight campus and across the University of Oregon. I'm just absolutely thrilled that Ned and Carol are here today. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you. Some of you may know they also support, so these are sort of two parallel entrepreneurship speaker series. So they also support the Robert Family Launch Strategy Seminar Series. So our seminar series is about bringing in renowned external entrepreneurs to sort of teach our community about their journey. The Launch Strategy Seminar Series is a collaboration between Launch Oregon and the Lundquist College of Business. And the idea there is to provide launch strategy coaching to startups that are emerging from U of O. And tonight it's very exciting. The Robert Family Launch Strategy Seminar will feature the Knight campus's own Pandaria Technologies. And I encourage anybody interested to attend that. Yeah. So go and give them advice, heckle them if you want, whatever you want to do. That's at 4 p.m. in Lundquist in the Lillis Room 440. So today, our speaker, we're really absolutely thrilled to have Tom Moss with us, University of Oregon alum and a leader whose career has truly embodied his career has truly embodied innovation in action. And Tom is from Japan, so I'm grateful that he's traveled all this way to be with us today. I should also say I'm really grateful to Tom because he was one of the first supporters of the Knight campus very early on. As an entrepreneur, you're a risk taker. So I remember meeting with Tom, and we hadn't done anything at this point, right? We didn't have a building, we didn't have a graduate program, and I said, I'm really worried about recruiting really top graduate students. And he said, well, what do you need? And I said, well, we need fellowships to recruit great students. And he stepped up and supported us very early on before we were really anything. So thank you very much for that, Tom. So Tom, let me tell you a little bit about him. Tom's a seasoned entrepreneur and technology executive with an impressive track record of building and scaling companies. He told us at dinner last night, 9 to date startup companies. Across mobile tech, consumer electronics, and robotics. Early in his career, he served as the first global head of business development for Android at Google. He does have an Android phone. I checked that last night. And he helped to shape the platform that really changed the smartphone world. Since then, he's founded and led multiple successful startups, including 3LM, acquired by Motorola, and Nextbit, acquired by Razer, and he's held senior leadership roles at Motorola, Razer, and Skydio, where he served as the company's first chief operating officer and later as CEO for the Asia Pacific region. Tom's a prolific inventor. He has 25 patents to his name. He's an active angel investor, investing in over 40 companies to date. And he's a mentor and advisor to a lot of next-generation founders, giving back through programs like Techstars. His talk today, titled Entrepreneurship as a Profession, Tom's going to share what he's learned over decades of experience, that entrepreneurship isn't just something for people that are born to do it. It's really a skill that anyone can develop. He'll talk about pivots and pitfalls and even the role of luck and how we can all improve our chances of success by approaching entrepreneurship as a craft that can be practiced and refined. So please join me in welcoming Tom Moss.
1 second. All right, seems to be working. Great, so oops. Let's see, this got minimized. All right. I think this is the end. Sorry. What happened here? Oh, this is not. I apologize. Seem to have lost the presentation. Maybe not. All right. You guys are going to let me just not share my entire desktop for a second? Since that could be embarrassing. All right. All righty. There we go. Got it back. All right. Let me slot back in. second. All right. It's always a little bit of technical difficulties. The rule is if you're doing a demo, everything's going to break. So I don't actually have any products to demo, but I feel like I've still angered the demo gods. Hopefully next demo I do will not have glitches, but I doubt it. So let me get started. Let's see. The clicker might not be. All right. I'm going to go old school. As Bob mentioned in his nice introduction, what I really want to talk about is entrepreneurship as a profession, and specifically serial entrepreneurship as a craft. As Bob mentioned, I'm a serial entrepreneur, and I think that people often talk of entrepreneurship as a secondary trait. I'm the CEO of blah, 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 and founder. I'm a CTO and co-founder. I'm a blank. I'm a doctor and a founder in the medical device space, as some of our illustrious alumni are. But I tend to think of it really as a profession, right? So it's not necessarily something you are, it is something that you do. And I think that distinction is a little bit important because I think as a society, we tend to create a mythology around founders. And kind of that, it's a specific archetype of a personality or a person of certain backgrounds, of certain characteristics. But I think if we look at it more as a profession, the good news is it's something you can get better at, right? It's something you can study even ahead of doing it the first time, right? It's something you can learn through the experience of others and then get better at it as you do it. And so I think that's important to kind of understand because it's really open for everybody. And you'll see in a second as I get into it, I came to it with a very non-traditional path. As Bob mentioned, I won't go over this, but I've done a lot of startup stuff over the past 20 years. Everything from starting companies to being at big tech. I've been on the acquiring side of M&A for tech. I've been on the selling side of M&A for tech. I've gone through the IPO process once. I'm an angel investor in a number of companies. I'm a limited partner in a handful of VC funds, and I've invented some patents. So I've really seen kind of the entire 360, I think, of the startup ecosystem. And that's an important point to make. I'm living in Japan, as Bob mentioned, these days, and I noticed something really interesting there in the tech scene that's still very nascent and new, which is a lot of people don't actually understand what a startup is versus a business that may or may not leverage technology, right? So not all businesses that leverage technology are startups. They can be fine businesses, but they're not my area of expertise. So I can't tell you what would make a successful bakery, even if it's technology enabled somehow, because I just don't have that kind of experience for those type of business. So my focus my entire career has been around technology startups. And I've been struggling over the years to come up with a definition for what is a startup versus a business that leverages technology or is based on a technology product. And the best I can come up with so far, and maybe this will improve over time, but this is my current version of it, is a startup is a business that can get funded by venture capitalists. I think it's kind of self-referential, but I think it's actually really true. It doesn't mean you have to take venture capital. A lot of companies bootstrap, not a lot maybe, but a number of companies bootstrap or kind of grow on their own or self-fund or whatever. But it means it's a type of company that can get investment from venture capitalists, right? I think that's what defines a startup. If a VC gives you money or is willing to give you money if you pitch them, then that makes you a startup versus a small business. And the reason I think that's important is if you're interested in doing a technology startup, you have to understand the VC part of the equation, the funding and financing part of the equation. It's quite different from grants. Grants can be a great source of funding. A lot of startups get SBIR, phase 2s or phase 1s or even direct to phase 3 sometimes. But it's much more common in my world to get funding, outside funding from investors, be it angel investors or at larger amounts from venture capitalists. And so I do think it's important to realize that if you're trying to build a startup in the traditional sense or in the Silicon Valley sense of it, there are certain characteristics to it that would be attractive to venture capitalist investors. And primarily it has to do with the level of ambition. So Bob and I were just talking about this. Another trait I found in Japan is that the level of ambition for the entrepreneurs is quite limited compared to Silicon Valley in terms of the aspirations for the end state of the company. The level of talent is there, the level of education is very high, the work ethic is very strong, and yet we see a complete lack, honestly, of global startups, just complete and utter lack, right? If you look at the top 50 companies by market cap in Japan, most of them are quite old, right? I don't think there's any of them that were started after the 70s, right? And so it's just an area where I'm spending a lot of my time now trying to help grow and facilitate the ecosystem. And I think this level of ambition is important in the way it relates to US companies too, is that you have to understand that for a venture capital investor, they really have a very binary view of the kind of preferred outcomes of your startup, meaning they want you to either become the biggest thing ever or go bankrupt and not exist, right? They're not interested in kind of the middle state that a small business might be interested in, right? Just generating cash flow and surviving for a while and kind of growing at a reasonable linear growth rate. They're always looking for exponential growth rates, right? They're looking for something that has the potential to become very, very significant, and that goes, it's kind of a tangent for today, but since I'm on the topic, it goes back to just how VCs do math, right? So VC outcomes are very heavily centered on outlier outcomes, right? Sometimes referred to as the power law, right? And so a very, very significant outcome basically creates all of the value, and everything else doesn't. And so they want you to be extremely ambitious, and the way that's expressed is in the failure rate, right? And so in Japan, I believe after 5 years, 80% of startups are still in business, right? That's much, much higher. And they see that as a strength, but that's actually, I believe, if you're trying to get US VC, that's a weakness, because it means you're not being ambitious enough. You're not trying to grow fast enough, or you're not taking enough risk with your idea to begin with. And so if you're interested in startups, I think it's very important to understand that what VCs are looking for. And if you're trying to approach the kind of tier one, larger VC funds in Silicon Valley, I think the rest of the world hasn't appreciated the fact that unicorns are no longer interesting to those level of funds, right? And so even saying that like we can build $1 billion business isn't that interesting anymore, because their funds are so big that the math doesn't work, right? If their outlier outcomes are at $1 billion exits, that doesn't work anymore. They can't return meaningful funds back to their limited partners. And so the level of ambition for startups in the US for the tier ones has to be just insanely high, right? But I think those are the funnest companies to work on. I have a very specific personality type that likes the 0-1 outcome. So I think that suits me well for Silicon Valley type technology startups. And so, just keep in mind that if you're doing a startup and you're trying to get VC financing, be as ambitious as you can possibly. Think about an end state for your company and how to get there. That's just massive. And work on that, because every business is hard, right? And I would say an insanely ambitious business isn't necessarily, relatively speaking, that much harder. Like, every business is hard. Tom's Bakery is a hard business, right? You have to, source your ingredients, you have to pay your employees, you have to rent. There's all kinds of things that can happen, right? Every business is hard, so you might as well be as ambitious as possible, because if it does succeed, you want to have the biggest kind of impact on society and the world. And so for me, my career is focused a lot on physical products. I like atoms more than bits. I'm sure a lot of the people here are of the same inclination if you're part of the program here at night. And so I like to create physical products. I look at startups as a vehicle for kind of creation, right, where you can bring new and interesting products into the world. And so these are some of the products that I've gotten to work on. So I had a startup called Nextbit. We created that phone, which I still think is one of the better looking phones ever made. I'm extremely biased, and I especially love this color. And so it obviously, this feeds into my own personal taste, but we created our own device, and we created actually a cloudified version of the operating system where a user would never run out of storage on their device. Everything would be synchronized and backed up to the cloud, and you could also start an activity in one device and continue exactly where we left off on another device. That was acquired by a gaming hardware company called Razer. Razer makes high-end laptops, keyboards, headsets, mice for PC gamers. And so our second generation phone, you can see kind of the similar design language, but gamified, made more for gamers in terms of the kind of the characteristics they like. It featured the first device. This was the first device with a dynamic refresh rate display that could go up to 120 hertz. So we clocked the display to your actual output for your GPU so that you weren't wasting battery, but you could have very, very smooth gameplay animations and things like that. And actually, we did the cool project where we slotted that as the mouse. You actually slotted the phone. There was a USB-C port here. You slotted the phone in, and then this is just a shell keyboard and display, right? And so you could have a laptop form factor with your keyboard, with your Android phone, which I really, really loved this product, and I really wish that there were still products like this in market instead of carrying full-fledged, especially now that everything's in the cloud anyway. Running it off your phone just seems like a no-brainer. Then I kind of got really sick of phones after being in the smartphone space for about 11 years, and was kind of looking for other things that could benefit from the economics of scale in the components of smartphones, and encountered some people who were thinking about doing a flying smartphone. And that was a company called Skydio. Skydio is doing really well. It's about 1,000 people now today, doing tremendously and on a great path. And our technology there was that we built fully autonomous drones, right? So these are drones that could complete and execute their tasks with no human intervention, right? And so this was really, really fun. Got me into all kinds of robotics stuff. We did a bunch of government use cases, state and federal, and local government, as well as enterprise and consumer. So as I mentioned, my path to entrepreneurship was not straightforward. I was a Japanese studies major at the University of Oregon, and that was almost just a kind of last-minute happenstance because I unintentionally, as in unplanned, ended up spending half of my undergrad time in Japan as an exchange student. And so when I came back second term senior year, I kind of looked at all my credits and was like, okay, what can I graduate in? And it was like, all right, Japanese studies. I'm like, that's it, that's my major. I had pivoted my major a number of times throughout college. And I actually started my first business while at the University of Oregon. It was a very small business. So this was in the late 90s. And part of the reason I was in Japan for 2 years is because my third day there on what was originally a 3-month exchange program, I met a girl, and we liked each other, and we've been together for quite a while now. We've been married for about 25 years, dating before that. And so decided to stay. But when I did come back, I needed to communicate pretty frequently with her, but I didn't have any money, and I was a very poor student. And so this was the time that VoIP, Voice over Internet Protocol, was just starting to take off and become available, but there were still termination fees that you were charged if you're calling landlines or cell phones in another country, right? And so it wasn't completely computer to computer, but there were businesses being built around, kind of solving that problem for you, and I essentially started a business selling that service to other students, international students. I was living at the international dorm, Riley, so I had a great customer base there, people who needed to make calls, and I did this in order to subsidize the purchase of the PC and other equipment and things that I needed in order to call my now wife. And so, but I never thought of myself as entrepreneurial. I just was like, I'm poor, I need a way to call her. This was a solution. And so when I graduated, I actually didn't know what I wanted to do. And again, going back to my wife, I kind of suggested that she move to America, and so that we could be together. And she was like, well, what are you doing with your life? Like, she had a career and a job already. She was a little bit older, and she's like, what are you going to do? And I'm like, I don't know. And she's like, well, figure it out. So I went to the bookstore. I got a U.S. News magazine. Back then, we actually had paper magazines, and looked at graduate school programs. And there was one about MBA, there was some about PhD, and there was one about law. And I was always interested in technology, and this is during the dot-com boom days still. And I read about this law firm that was taking equity from all of its clients instead of cash, and how great they were doing. And I'm like, well, that's brilliant. Like, you're just getting this portfolio of equity in all these amazing startups, and everything makes money, right? So, because it can only go up. And so this sounds like a great place to be. And so I ended up going to law school. I went to UCLA Law School, and then the dot-com boom crashed my sophomore year. I was going to work at this firm, Brobeck, that was actually the one featured, and they went bankrupt when the bubble burst. So apparently getting some cash is an important, that's an important lesson there. If you're wondering what the lesson there is, it's like, don't take all equity. Take some cash off the table. But I was an attorney And I was working at law firms, more traditional law firms, but focused on technology transactions, right? So IP licensing, patents, copyright, et cetera. And I really enjoyed it because I got to go deep into all the technology because you had to understand what you're acquiring, what you're not, what potentially open source issues, all these things. And then I ended up going in-house as an attorney at Google. Back in the early days, I think Google was about 10,000 employees, which felt huge back then. But obviously it's much bigger now. And because I had been doing open source, one of the projects that I got assigned to work on was Android, which was very, very new at the time. Google had just acquired it. The team was maybe about 60 people when I started working on it. And eventually I got really close with the team and started supporting them in a lot of ways. And it seemed to make sense for me to move over directly to the team and lead out kind of all of the go-to-market business efforts, all the partnerships with handset manufacturers, chipset manufacturers, so Qualcomm, Samsung, Sony, Motorola, and then all of the carriers, AT&T, Verizon, et cetera. And I basically created that ecosystem and managed it and kind of got to ride the really fun wave with Google of Android going from zero. So we started working on it a couple years before we launched the first device. And when I left in 2010 to start my first real kind of serious startup, we were already like on a very clear path to, it was actually the fastest adopted operating system of all time. We had just beat Windows, I think, in terms of installs, right? Which was crazy to me, having grown up when I did, like in the 90s. Microsoft was like the giant, unassailable, right? The Wintel monopoly, but I was really, really proud of that. So the TLDR here is that there's no kind of clear path to entrepreneurship, right? I had that experience at U of O with the VoIP thing, but I didn't think of it as a business or anything like that. It was just something I needed to do. And I didn't really consider entrepreneurship as a viable profession until I was at Google and spent a number of years there and saw other people leaving and starting companies and going, oh, that seems to be a thing you should do. Like, you should leave and start companies. That's interesting. Like, let me go try that. And I love it. It's the best decision I ever make. So my talk today is kind of about, just bringing it back to the topic, serial entrepreneurship. Again, with definitions, you'll see that I love definitions. This is the lawyer in me. I don't like to talk about anything without defining it. And by the way, very quick aside about, there is a lot of overlaps, I think, between contract drafting and coding, right? Where you basically have to define certain functions and then like make calls to them over time with a contract. I think that's why AI, this is a complete tangent, but I think this is why AI, generative AI is so good at contracts and things like that, because it's actually very logical if you're doing it right. All right, so an entrepreneur obviously is somebody who builds a company, and a serial entrepreneur, I think, is, should be somebody who actually spends time studying and enhancing the craft by, of the process around building companies, tries to come up with formulas around building companies in order to increase the odds of success, right? And so this reason I talk about serial entrepreneurs specifically versus entrepreneurship is, again, influenced very much by my time in Japan. And it's actually fairly uniquely American to have serial entrepreneurship. So even in Europe, it's a lot less common. And in Japan, it's almost unheard of. If you were lucky enough to have an exit of some sort, you kind of retire to a quiet life after that for the most part, or you stay in your company, until the day you retire or die. But like leaving and starting something new is very, very new and foreign over there. But it's very, very important, right, for startup ecosystems. And so one of the first talks I did, I was invited by the University of Tokyo and JETRO, which is a government agency that is supposed to, economic and trade and all those things, and is supposed to help startups in Japan. And they did this study crafted by the University of Tokyo about what is it required to have a good startup ecosystem. And they basically came up with those three criteria on the right. So access to good mentors, access to top tier venture capital funds, and as its own item, like having serial entrepreneurs. And there's a lot of data on this. There's a venture capital investor in Silicon Valley who wrote a book called Super Founders. And what he did was he was trying to find what commonalities existed among the founders of unicorn startups at that time that he wrote the book, right? So he looked across the entire available data set, and he basically analyzed, and he grouped things. He grouped industry expertise, university attended, level of education attained, what major, was it a hard, technology major versus not, where they were geographically. He looked at all of these, and he found that actually the most impactful variable in terms of whether or not a startup would become a unicorn was whether or not one of the founders has prior experience as an entrepreneur. And the net result of his research is that a founder who had a modicum of success, so 10 million in revenue or above a $10 million exit, starting a new company, had a 3.3 times higher chance of becoming a unicorn, that company becoming a unicorn than not, which is incredibly significant. If you think about, as an investor, you can buy 2 lottery tickets, and one is 330% more likely to win, you're definitely going to spend all your money on that, right? And so serial entrepreneurs have a much higher chance if they had a modicum success, but also, even if they didn't achieve that level of success, they still have a 1.6x time higher chance of achieving becoming a unicorn with the next startup, right? So I think the key for entrepreneurship is it's a journey. Like, it doesn't just have to be one time. And I think the data really shows that having serial entrepreneurs really, really helps the US have this dynamic, vibrant ecosystem. And so this makes me curious, like, okay, so what is it that serial entrepreneurs understand that makes them so valuable? What do you learn in the process? And for me, I think it's these 5 things on the right there. You learn timing, curiosity, velocity, pivots, and exits. So timing is mostly about identifying emergent trends that will create opportunities for a new product or service. So obviously right now the trend is AI. I mean, it can't be more obvious, right? Like, it's the biggest platform shift, trend, new technology, whatever, that we've had in such a long time, right? But there's always trends, and there's big trends and little trends, right? So AI is the big trend. There's a lot of little trends happening right now, right? Improvements across different disciplines and sciences that enable new products and services. And so there's a lot of startups. There's more startups that die for being too early than too late, I believe, right? Especially in the deep tech space where I spend my time. So deep tech is very interesting because we'll have some technological breakthrough or something happen where you believe a product can come to market, and it can, but there might be issues around the distribution of that or the mass production of it or whatever it is, or just even what consumers are willing or interested in buying, right? That may not add up. And so a lot of startups, they actually fail because they bring products to market too early. We've seen this in consumer electronics all the time, and obviously with the smartphone, we saw it very, very clearly with General Magic and other kind of incarnations later, Danger and others, right, where they were just a little bit too early because we didn't have networks that were high bandwidth enough to be able to do significant things on the internet. Displays, it was before we had touch displays, right, or we had we didn't have capacitive displays, right, things like that. And so it's just being early is a very, very common thing in deep tech. So understanding timing means seeing a trend and kind of riding that wave of that trend, but not so early, right? So Eric Schmidt at Google always used to say, like, it's like surfing. You're on the board looking for that wave, right? You're not flapping your arms as much as possible trying to make a wave happen. That's not going to have the momentum to carry you, right? And so it's finding these waves and then finding the right time to kind of ride them. And then curiosity, I think, is really important, which means basically being always wanting to learn more about your product, your customers, and their needs. This is very, very important. And this can be trained, which I'll talk about in a little bit later. Speed, it's your number one advantage. Every bigger company is better resourced. They have more money, they have more people, they have a lot more access. But they don't have speed because there's a lot of corporate overhead, there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of other issues that slow down the speed of development, where a startup can focus on that singular thing and just move really fast. So this is your biggest weapon. Pivots, this is a little bit more art than science, but you can science it by instrumenting like your product and understanding user behavior and what's working and what's not, right? So Fred Wilson is a very successful early stage entrepreneur. He said that 85% of his best investments, like if you just looked, he also tried to classify, every VC tries to understand what is the thing, right? And he looked at 85% of his investments, most successful investments were pivots, where they pivoted from what he had invested in originally in terms of what they were doing, right? And so pivots and understanding pivots is very important. And then in order to be a serial entrepreneur, you have to exit one way or the other, right? Your company has to end. And so understanding kind of some of the things around there, I think, is one of the things serial entrepreneurs bring to market. So I'm going to deep dive a little bit into these things by talking about my first serious startup, which was 3LM, short for 3 Laws of Mobility, for any Asimov fans in the room. So 3LM was, I was at Google, I could see the rise of smartphones. At the time, though, in the enterprise, everybody was still using BlackBerries, right? So this is early enough in the trade. People always think like, oh, 2007 came out, iPhone came out, and like everybody switched to smartphones. But they only sold like 6 million units the first year. If you look at Nokia's device sales, 2007 was their best year ever in history, and then 2008 was their best year in history, and then 2009 was their best year in history, and then 2010 was their best year in history, right? So Nokia was still growing pretty significantly during the early smartphone years, and in the enterprise, everybody was using a device called BlackBerries, created by a Canadian company called Research in Motion, that were very secure and kind of integrated with Exchange and all these kind of Microsoft-based email and Office and like solutions that were being used by corporations. But it was pretty clear, if you're in the industry, that smartphones were taking off, and because they were so capable, people were obviously going to use it for at least their email, if not other kind of capabilities. And so that was the wave, that was the trend, right? So the big wave was smartphones, but the little wave was there's this IT group that's going to be freaking out about people like forwarding their work email to their personal email so they can access it on the go, right? And what are they going to do about that? And so we concluded there was a market need for IT to secure and manage employees doing iOS and Android devices for work. That was the idea, and so we're like, there's a company to be built here. We had no idea what we would build, right? So this is where curiosity comes in, right? So we didn't start with a feature set. We just went out to IT people and were like, so how do you feel about smartphones? What are you seeing? What are you worried about? And then that evolved to, okay, give us a feature list, right? And we'll just go build that. Literally, like, just tell me what I need to build and I'll build it. And that works in enterprise sales. Enterprise sales is much easier than consumer, right? Consumers are terrible, fickle. I hate them. I love making consumer products. It's so much more fun and so much more rewarding, but it's so much harder, right? Enterprises, you can just go sit down to a buyer and be like, what do you need? How much will you pay? All right, I'll go build that, right? It's beautiful. And so that's what we did. We basically just went out and got a feature set. And then we moved quickly, right? So we demoed in 3 months, alpha in 6, full product in less than a year, right? So focus and speed is really your only advantage. So that's got to be the thing that you really follow. And then we had an exit actually very early. We took a very early exit. So we had our first acquisition offer, I think, within a month of starting the company, right? Because the space was so focused on. But of course, I think that would have undervalued the company. And so we kept going for about a year. But the kind of interest that we had garnered throughout the time really kind of grew and grew until it became kind of obvious that we should take it. And one thing about this is it was definitely not a unicorn IPO. It was definitely not a unicorn exit. And so the VCs were actually not in favor of selling the company. And so this is something where you're not necessarily going to be aligned with the VCs. So going back to what I talked about earlier with ambitions, right? So they want you to go to the moon or crash, right? They don't really want these kind of in-betweeners because they're not significant enough to move the fund. Like if you have $1 billion fund that you're investing out of and somebody sells a company for $100 million and you own 10% of that, you made a $10 million profit, maybe you doubled, triple, whatever, quadruple your investment. That's not going to be meaningful return to the fund itself, right? But for us, we did the math in terms of the dilution that we would take through future rounds of, so enterprise is great, enterprise is expensive. And the reason it's expensive is because a lot of it becomes about channel and distribution and hiring a bunch of salespeople to go out and then having booths at conferences and taking people out to steak dinners and all these kinds of things, right? And so we looked at other enterprise companies. At the time, Box was kind of like the one we did our math based off of, right? And we looked at kind of like the dilution that we thought we would have to take and the rounds that it would take to get to an IPO exit and what that would actually mean financially to us versus the money that we can get right now. And we were like, oh, it almost was a wash. And then if you're thinking about time value of money and risk, you're like, okay, well, this is pretty obvious. And so we did that. And so that's something that, I love. All my startups are VC backed. Every startup I've ever done is VC backed, but it is, you should go into it knowing that, there is a chance, a very high chance that at some point your kind of priorities might misalign. And so that's just something you should be aware of and learn to manage. And of course, the answer when a VC asks in the beginning is always, absolutely, we're going to IPO, we're going to the moon. Like, it's never like, oh, if there's a good exit, we'll take it. That is a horrible answer, and nobody will invest in you. So that is a very important tip. Always say you're going for the moon, but when an offer comes in, like, I don't regret it for a second. It was a great outcome for us. And it helped build us up. Every single employee that we had, we were 7 at the time of the acquisition, every single person from that time has gone on to become a founder or co-founder with their own startup. Like, we all had such a great experience. We all loved it. So like, it, kind of created this secondary and third tertiary wave of startups, which was amazing. So this is, again, I like to have definitions or formulas. So what does it take for a startup to succeed? Like, what is the thing you should learn how to do? So I think this is the formula that I came up with, which is obsession plus execution, which are under your control, added and then multiplied by luck. You can't add luck, you multiply, because luck can really swing like immensely, right? But you can improve your odds of success. So you can kind of make your own luck a little bit, or at least increase your chances of getting lucky, and I'll talk about that in a second. So start with obsession. So right now, when you first start your company in your early stage, the thing that VCs are going to be looking for is founder market fit, right? It's how much do they believe this person understands this market, right? Or cares about this market, or spending time thinking about this market. What I found is that curiosity can be trained, right? So I would consider myself a very curious person now. I would not have considered myself that in the beginning of my entrepreneurship journey, right? I've actually trained myself to be more of a curious person. And the way you do that is just training yourself to ask questions, right? Because you want to ask questions of your customers, you want to ask questions of your engineers, you want to ask questions of anybody you meet who can be a mentor or has experience or find some value. And so you can practice this in every social interaction. People love talking about themselves, right? Huge psychology break. Like, you ask people about themselves, they're happy to tell you. And it's a great habit to have. Like, it's great. I actually hate small talk. It's not something that I enjoy doing. But I find that, when you ask people questions, there's a lot of interesting stuff. And people have all kinds of interesting jobs that you just don't know anything about, and, all kinds of things that they're passionate about. And so really creating like a habit of curiosity, I think, is really, really important to increase your odds of success. And then being an expert in what it is you're doing and presenting that when you're fundraising is really, really important. And then there's the execution part. And the execution part is kind of like, well, okay, what does that break down into? And I think it breaks down to, for a founder, it breaks down to three kind of core things. You have to have fuel in the tank, right? You have to have your power source. You have to have funding, right? That gets you going. Then you have to have, a good team, makes or breaks everything, right? And then you have to lead that team. And I'm going to break that down a little bit. So if you look at fundraising and recruiting, it's a type of sales. And there's some VCs who say, oh, I don't like sales founders and things like that. I only invest in hard, deep tech engineers. The reality is every successful entrepreneur has to be good at sales, because you have to fundraise and you have to recruit, right? And that is a type of sales. It's not the, will you buy the sandwich for me kind of sales, but it is a type of sale. And specifically, I think if you break it down, it's a combination of storytelling and confidence. Again, psychology trick. People just react well to confidence. They just assume you know what you're talking about. Everybody's so insecure. They see somebody who's confident. They're like, oh, he must really understand something, because I know I'm super anxious and this person's got it together. So wow, they're great. Like, they must know something. And essentially all the time it's fake. I mean, there's definitely people who are confident and they shouldn't be. But for the most part, I've experienced in Silicon Valley, it's either learned behavior or you grow into it, or you just fake it, right? Fake it till you make it with confidence. And so confidence, you just look in the mirror. Affirmations, things like that actually work, right? Little psychological tricks you can look into for boosting confidence. And then the other skill, though, is storytelling, right? So fundraising, recruiting, and even leading the company, right, and setting that vision forward, that is a form of storytelling. And so that's, if you're interested in becoming an entrepreneur, I think, kind of deep diving into storytelling, being able to tell a compelling story is a really, really important skill. And it's, again, something you can invest in and become better at, right? And then the other part is the driving urgency. So leading, there's a lot of things, morale and like making sure the company's communicating well and moving in the same direction. There's a lot of tactical stuff, but from a high level kind of strategy, CEO should just like push everybody all the time to move faster. It's really annoying. Again, not a personality habit. I don't like to bother people. I like to get along with people and say nice things to people, but you have to learn to drive urgency, right? So lack of momentum is what kills startups, right? 100% of the time, right? And so forcing yourself to kind of have that personality where you're driving urgency, this is part of curiosity too. You're asking people what they're doing, and you're kind of questioning, not in a rude way, but just like, could we do this faster? What if we cut this, step? Like, can this happen any faster? And then explaining to them the importance of certain things, like happening on a certain schedule, right, is really important. So I think that's kind of like the skill based on the execution. I would say it's the confident storytelling, and then it's kind of like driving urgency through your organization, right? It's kind of the things I would focus on. And then it's driving iteration, right? So even if it's not a big pivot, every successful company and product has to go through a series of iterations. There's a famous axiom in Silicon Valley, Facebook really promoted this internally, right? Perfect is the enemy of good, right? If your only advantage is speed, waiting until everything's perfect and exactly right and there's no complaints and all that, that's just going to kill you, right? So get to market with the minimum set of features that a user will find some benefit out of, and then instrument that product to the best of your ability, if you can, if it's software, right? Or it has a software component. Instrument is in like, you see the behavior, see what people are using and not. Or if it's not, go talk to your customers all the time, regularly. Are you using it? Why not, right? Try to embed yourself or your employees with the customers and really understand what's working and what's not for your product, and then pivot and iterate and iterate and iterate. There's no perfect, just like writing, there's no perfect first draft, right? It's rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. And then of course you have to multiply that by luck. So you can do all these things and still fail. That's the bad news of entrepreneurship. Like you could be a great entrepreneur. It is something, again, I believe it's a craft. You can study it, you can get better at it. But at the end of the day, some amount of luck is required. And I've seen terrible entrepreneurs do really well with a lot of luck, and I've seen great entrepreneurs do really poorly. I've seen it all, I really have. Like 20 years, you see it all, right? And so you have to know that going into it, that there is some amount of luck that's required. But the skill, I think, again, going back to serial entrepreneurs, I think what you learn is that there are ways you can increase your chances of getting lucky, right? So obviously the most important one is just lasting longer, right? Because if luck is a sort of external circumstances aligning in a way that's going to catalyze your business, there's more chance of that happening the longer you are around, right? There's the more opportunities, let's say, for that to happen. So being disciplined about your burn, moving quickly, right? So you're not wasting money in terms of salaries and operating costs, more than needed. And then, of course, being good at fundraising, helps all those things. Again, catching a wave, like making sure that you're in an industry or in an area where there's momentum already happening that you can basically scavenge or utilize, right? Is really important. And then the pivots, like measure, iterate, really instrument your product to the best that it can be for that type of product, or come up with a platform or system for getting feedback as quickly as possible, and then systematically looking at it, evaluating it, and making decisions based on it. And then, of course, the other skill part of luck is recognizing when you're getting lucky, and then shifting resources to take advantage of that. And there's a phrase that people like in Silicon Valley called the prepared mind, right? So you can't control luck by definition, right? It's an externality, but you can make sure that you kind of keep a broad view of what's happening. Again, talking to people, talking to your customers, talking to your other companies in your space, talking to investors, and just kind of making sure you're always kind of getting a lot of inputs. There's a lot of noise in that signal, but I think you should accumulate as much of it as possible, and then you'll just kind of synthesize it internally. And then when something happens, if you can recognize that luck happening faster than a competitor, for example, right, you will succeed. And so this kind of prepared mind attitude, right, of just like trying to keep up with everything, which is hard, but that is, as a founder, you have to do both. You have to be able to be comfortable with the 30,000-foot view and on the ground level, right? You have to be able to jump in and out of both. I think that is what makes a really good founder, right? Somebody who can jump into a detail, right, with an employee, like if whatever the bottleneck issue is at that time, like jump into the very, very specific details and help people think through things, right? But also then, jump back up to the 30,000-foot view. Are we doing the right thing? What's happening in the industry? What's happening in our customers? What's happening in VC community right now that I need to be aware of, right? And so my final piece of advice is actually related to that. So I think you should overload yourself with information related to what you're doing. And then I kind of trust your gut, right? And I think it's the same thing for advice like this, from what I just gave you about startups. Startups are like children, right? If you have a child, everybody has advice. And their advice is always based on the N of one or two of their own children, right? Or their relatives or whatever it is. But every child is quite different and unique. And so some advice that people give you could be great, and some advice is completely meaningless. And it's going to be exactly the same with your startup. And that means, by the way, investors, mentors, professors, it runs the whole gamut. There's no lack of bad advice sources, right? There's no limit to the sources of bad advice. So at the end of the day, the best you can do is not to over-rotate over any one conversation, but to just kind of synthesize it all, let it kind of sit inside of you, and just kind of go with your feeling, like based on what you know. Again, if you're obsessed with what you're doing, and you're talking to customers, and you're talking to your team, you should have the best sense of all. There should be nobody on the planet who knows the ins and outs of what you need to know better than you, right? If that is the case, you're doing something wrong, right? Because you're failing the obsession part, right? It's obsession plus execution times luck. So on the obsession part, you need to be the expert in what your company is doing, period, right? At every level that you can, every level of depth that you can. And then if you get a lot of advice and information, I think you'll just naturally feel like, oh, that really sounds right to me, or it doesn't. I'm a big believer in instincts. I think we accumulate so much more information than is in our conscious active mind, right? But I think it's somewhere in there, right? And so your kind of available data set internally in a subconscious level, I think is much, much broader and bigger. And I think that you do kind of gut instinct can be a way to kind of access that, right? Just something that feels right. You don't exactly know why. Maybe take time for you to articulate why, but you just feel it. And I think you should trust that. And so with all advice, including mine, just follow your gut and take what you think is right and then ignore what you think isn't. Thank you so much. I hope that was somewhat useful. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Tom. That was amazing. So much, practical, tangible advice. We've got microphones that are going around. People can ask questions. I'll go ahead and start while the microphone's going over there.
Sure.
What would you consider your biggest success, and what'd you learn, and what was your biggest failure, and what'd you learn?
Wow. Okay, that's a hard question just off the bat. God damn. All right. I still think 3LM is of my it's kind of biggest in every sense success, because it's really what kind of trained me as an entrepreneur. And I think what we did right was nobody on the team had ever worked in enterprise or IT or anything like that. We did not know anything. We knew that there was going to be market needs for a solution for IT to kind of manage and track mobile devices and the access that they give to the infrastructure, but we didn't know anything. And so we just asked questions all the time. And I think that really was kind of the biggest unlock, right? And so I think that's the biggest kind of reason for that success. The biggest failures have been when I've overplayed my hand in terms of negotiations or exits or things like that. It's kind of being overconfident and not understanding your relative position with the other side. There's a number of those where I was really sure something was going to happen and kind of was a little bit cocky about it and kind of aggressive and overplayed my hand, right, in terms of the negotiation, what I was trying to get, be it an exit price or whatever it is, and then have it all kind of blow up, right? So I think that is my biggest, in general, for exits especially, and for fundraising, like almost nothing counts except money in the bank, right? People can say, a lot. I've had one startup, the CEO of a large tech company, and I met, shook hands, looked eye contact, all gonna happen, no problem. We kind of stopped working on certain things because I was so sure it was gonna happen, and then it didn't, right? It fell through, and it took months of sorting that out, and then to recover from that, because you're like, oh shit, now we have to actually do those things that we weren't doing because it didn't make sense in an acquisition sense, but now we're not acquired. So I think that's the biggest failures.
Tom was confident he was going to sell me 500 of his newest product last night at dinner.
I am still confident. I am still confident.
It still might happen.
As a first order.
Yeah, right.
Testing. Okay, great. Thanks so much for the insightful
Sure.
talk. I have a question. Earlier in the presentation, you mentioned what it takes to create the ideal entrepreneurial ecosystem. So, what do you think that Eugene is doing well in that area, and what do you think are maybe areas of improvement?
Sure. So I think everything, and I'm not just saying this because he's my host here today, but I think everything that Bob's doing in the Night Campus is the right kind of amazing start. So start with the kind of pick an area of focus. You want to create an ecosystem. So I think what people don't understand about Silicon Valley is one of the things that's so easy to build a startup there is because whatever you need in your company in terms of human talent, resource, and understanding is there in spades. So you're building XYZ startup, you need a product manager who's scaled from 0 to 1. At that phase, you need a 0 to 1 product manager who's scaled this type of product successfully before or has been around that. And then at a growth stage, you need a growth PM, right? You need an engineer who understands how to scale a back end. This is aging myself, right? This used to be a thing. You used to actually have to think about how to scale servers and things like that. Obviously, these days it's a lot easier. But and it's all available and right there. And so it's really hard to do cold starts, right? It's just really, really hard to do cold starts. And so I think having a focus on specific industry verticals where you can accumulate kind of a base, and then a lot of startups in deep tech especially are unlocked by multidisciplinary founders founders who understand their field very well, but actually understand a little bit of other fields or concepts from other related fields and can kind of put that together. And so having a focus on like a general theme, but then having different disciplines within that, I think is really important. I think what they're doing with Launch Oregon, you have to have access to funding. And right now, very few VCs will come to Oregon. I'm sure, even if like there was a demo day or something, like it's very unlikely that it would come here because they always look at like what they call the local maximus from previous outcomes. And so until, it's very catch-22, until there's a very successful startup out of an area, nobody cares about that area, right? And so you have to find a vehicle for fundraising, for funding these startups in the very beginning. And then of course it comes back to reputation too, right? You have to build a reputation in something to be known for, oh, okay, yeah, like their bioengineering programs, like that's, you know, I'm gonna take that versus, you know, for computer science, to be honest, like I don't think, you know, U of O or OSU kind of computer science degree is gonna get anybody's attention, right? And so I think you have to build kind of a reputation for excellence in the field to attract investors to invest in people from that field as well.
Thank you for an insightful talk. I was curious about your take on sustainability and the relation between the exponential growth and the more, let's say, traditional Japanese style of companies, and what is the right ratio of balance for a healthy technological ecosystem between those two approaches?
So this kind of goes back again to what you want to do. If you want to play the game, the Silicon Valley style game, the failure rate is very high. So even the top VCs like Sequoia have a 40% absolute failure rate, right? As in 40% of investments go to zero, and they're actually trying to increase that. They feel like that's actually bad, like that's too low, right? In general, for most top tier VC funds, 70% of the investments are either total failures or return 1 to 2 times the money, which for VCs is essentially a failure. Then another like 20-25% make a 3 to 5 kind of return on the money, which is okay, but really not that useful. And then a very, very small number will have 10x or more, and then 1 or 2 like per class will have these outliers that pays for everything, right? And so that is a very specific type of game. Like you have to understand if you're playing that game that that's what the VCs are looking for is only the companies that can go in that very last bucket, and everything else to them is a failure. But they'd rather that, again, you shoot for the moon or not. So if you're going for that, the problem with that model is it's usually very cash intensive because in order to grow very, very quickly, you need to spend, right? And so this is what some people have referred to as the factory model of VC, where they put you into a system where you raise a certain amount of money in order to achieve certain milestones within 18 months. And then the expectation is you achieve those milestones in 18 months and you fundraise again. And then you get a new set of milestones that you have to hit within 12 to 18 months so you can fundraise again, so you can fundraise again. And if you miss those, you have a flat round, you have a down round, or you might go bust, right? So it's higher risk for sure, but it comes back again to like velocity and just speed of execution. And there is a way to balance it. When times are bad in VC, which everything's cyclical, everybody's very concerned about burn rate and things like that. And when times are good, they tell you not to worry about it. My personal experience is you should always worry about it. Again, you want to increase your odds of getting lucky by being long. So I wouldn't over-rotate on what VCs are. I just understand the misalignment there potentially and try to manage, you know, to get to like burning as little as possible. There's lease equipment, don't buy it. You know, there's all kinds of things to stretch out your dollars, right? Little things you can do here and there. My current startup, most of our clinical trials to date, before FDA validation, we did in a foreign country where it's much, much cheaper, right? We're doing it in Pakistan, which is just insanely cheap compared to doing it in the US, right? That is a form of arbitrage that lets our company last longer, right? And do more with the money that we have. So always look to stretch your dollars. And don't get over-rotated on the VC thing, but understand that at the end of the day, it is this game of reaching milestones that will get you further fundraising is your goal, right, when you're doing this. And it's very cynical, but honestly, like, I think it's the most honest view you'll get, right? Everything else is kind of noise.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I work in the Center for Entrepreneurship. Thank you so much for coming.
Sure.
My question I have for you is, tell me some leadership qualities that are important to you.
Leadership qualities that are important. So there's a lot of really bad leaders in Silicon Valley who still get a lot out of their team. And I'm always struggling. My honest struggle as an entrepreneur is I worry that I'm too nice, right? Because as I mentioned, driving urgency is a skill. And there's definitely a conflict between being nice and driving urgency because you kind of have to be a little bit of a jerk. You know, it's really, interesting how to balance patting people on the back versus saying like, oh, this is good, but like, couldn't we do a little bit more? Couldn't we do 10x more? Couldn't we move a little faster? And that is absolutely learned. It's not my natural personality at all. I don't think, hopefully it's not many people's natural personality. But I think learning that kind of how to balance, like, recognizing success and recognizing accomplishment, but always leaving people feeling like there's still a little bit more they could do. I overperformed on bosses who expected unreasonable things from me. I know that. Like, looking back at my own career, right? Like, they expected things that were not reasonable for a person to achieve or do or work, or the amount of time they worked. But we did them, right? And those are like the hardest driven teams. It burns you out. I could never work, even after my own startups, I could never work as hard as I did on Android during the early days of Google. It's just, but I accomplished more than I thought I could because of that unrealistic demand. And so again, if you're empathetic, you're going to be less likely to expect unreasonable things because you're empathizing with the person. So you really have to kind of, unfortunately, cut that part of you out a little bit. And also firing quickly, firing well, underrated, very, very important skill. It's very hard when you're interviewing somebody to really get a great sense of them. You get feedback from other people, et cetera. People are not going to be that honest most of the time, right? We always tend to not complain or say bad things about people when they're getting references or things like that, even if we think it'll never get back to them. And so if somebody's not a fit, it doesn't serve them or you. It hurts everybody. And the worst thing is it can have an impact on the rest of your employees. If somebody notices somebody else is a B player, it makes them less interested in staying in your company or referring their friends who are A players or things like that. So firing well, which means firing quickly, I think is a very important skill. And again, it's not natural, it has to be trained.
So one more.
Great talk, thank you. I was just interested in your thoughts on the philosophy of the do things at scale, and you touched on a little bit when talking about like your burn rate and all of that, but I know that that's like a really big push in some situations that can actually cause a startup to fail because they know what those faucets are and they're trying to like create this like, this is what it'd be if we were at this many users or whatever, but they can't pull that off when they're 10 people or 12 people. So how do you balance or manage that? Because I know that's a big thing if you want that up and to the left with or for a VC to move on to that next round. But when you're like early stage, anyway, if you had any thoughts, that'd be great.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a very different answer for hardware and software. Very different. So for software, you can build for scale very easily now from day one, and you should. Where you should architect everything in a way where you can scale. You don't want to have too much technical debt or have to re-architect or refactor everything after launch because things weren't built to scale. And that is a very known thing these days. In 2025, there's no excuse for a software startup that didn't build for scale from day one, period, end of story. Hardware is much, much harder, right? More hardware companies, this is another axiom of Silicon Valley, more hardware startups die of indigestion than starvation is an often used phrase, meaning you bought too much inventory or supply or components or whatever it was because you didn't want to not have stuff on the shelf, right, when customers want it. That is the absolute death knell of every hardware startup. It's the number one reason why hardware startups are really hard. Everybody gets super excited. They think they're going to sell a bunch. They're like, oh my God, if we don't have stuff, because there's lead time, right? With hardware, you can't just turn around and be like, the reason venture capital really exists at the scale it does today is because software, right, there's no additional incremental cost for every additional unit, right? Compared to, it's like amazing. So you can scale through, now there's something on the internet you can distribute through, and there's no additional cost for you really. I mean, there's very incremental, like, some cost for bandwidth and EC2 and stuff with AWS or whatever you're using. Some very low cost, but really, essentially every new user is free for you, right? And so that's completely different. With hardware, you have very fixed costs. You have lead times for components. So my biggest advice for hardware companies is you should build your company around selling as many units of your first product as you need to get to a second product and no more. And if that means if you're successful, that means you're going to run out of inventory and there's going to be unmet demand and it's going to suck. But that is how you set yourself up for success, because the inverse is way too easy to kill yourself, right? And so figure out, literally like budget out, based on my margin, based on my costs, based on customer acquisition and all that, how many units do I need to sell to be able to then go ahead and do a second program? Because you're going to learn. That's the other problem, software versus hardware, is You launch software, you get feedback, you can change something, you can push it to production in a day, right? With hardware, you can't just be like, oh, I want an additional sensor. Like, that's really important. Okay. You can't rolling change that, right? You have to redesign everything. And so you will learn so much by being in market, but with hardware, it's really hard to have those learnings, especially with any kind of sample size significant enough to get kind of useful learnings. And so really build the entire startup around what do I need to do to make enough money to fund myself to a second program, right? Assuming no VCs or anything else. And if you can achieve that, then you're off to a great path. So that's my biggest piece of advice. Again, hardware startups almost always die from indigestion, right? They just overshoot on inventory and having stuff on the shelf, and it completely bankrupts them.
Tom, that was an amazing lecture. So many great
Thank you.
lessons. I don't know about all you, I already know I'm going to go back and rewatch the videotape of this lecture. So let's thank Tom for it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great talking. Okay. All right. Thanks,
All right.
thanks
Thank you, everybody.
coming.
Yeah.